to talk today about a study we recently published in the journal Sustainability on state of freshwater fisheries that was truth-checked using FishBase. The study was with Deng Palomares in Daniel Pauly's lab at UBC. So most water in the world has salt, but some does not. In fact, it's very little. Only about 0.02% of all liquid water lacks salt and is known as fresh water. Yet this water is extremely important for the world's fish and fisheries for four basic reasons. One is that these freshwater habitats have unusually high biodiversity. So in spite of the fact they only comprise about significantly less than 1% of liquid water, they contain about 40% of all fish species. And that's what this figure is showing here. The blue dots represent freshwater grouping. So a very large number of fish are found in freshwater species. Secondarily, freshwater is extremely productive, and the FAO data that we have, limited as it is, which I'll talk about a little bit later, suggests that about a third of all global fisheries production is coming from this tiny percent of the world's liquid water. Although a great deal of it is, there, you should be able to see my cursor, I hope. A great deal of it is aquacultural in nature, and nevertheless, far more than 1% of the world's fisheries production is clearly coming from fresh water. This volume of biomass of fish is indications are suggesting are particularly important to some of the world's poorest people living in African and Asian countries. And this is a figure from Peter McIntyre's work in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, showing, and hopefully you can see my cursor here, yes, and sorry for the poor quality, but the poorer countries basically use much more percentage of their proteins coming from river fishes than wealthier countries. And when you plot this out, in fact, it's evident that the river fisheries are much more important to poor people in Africa and Asia, or appear to be, than marine fisheries. Only wealthier countries, or at least moderately wealthy countries, can take advantage of marine fisheries, and that's what this figure is showing here, a shift from reliance on freshwater fish, which is extremely important to several hundred million people, to at least several hundred million people, to marine fisheries. Thirdly, making the case further for the importance of freshwater fisheries, which have been largely neglected, they are extremely valuable. And although we don't know the value of artisanal fisheries or commercial fisheries very well, we do know in some countries, United States and Canada in particular, that freshwater recreational fisheries are much more valuable actually than marine commercial fisheries in terms of actually dollars, economy generated. In fact, freshwater recreational fisheries are valued somewhere in the order of $40 billion a year in the United States, which dwarfs that of marine fisheries, with over 30 million anglers 10 years ago fishing actively in freshwater. And finally, as you all are aware, freshwater habitats, of course, are much smaller and exceptionally threatened by things like pollution, climate change. They're so shallow and accessible, they're easily polluted and subjected to warming and overfishing. Yet, in spite of this disproportionate importance of freshwater fisheries, freshwater and their fisheries, really very little is understood. What we do understand is almost entirely based on data voluntarily reported to the FAO of the United Nations. It's voluntarily reported, as are the marine fisheries, so it's a generally unknown quality and varying quality. The FAO then analyzes by country and region and reports it in terms of these FAO reports, Sophia reports, and there have been 3 special reports on freshwater. And there's only been about half a dozen peer-reviewed publications, which I'm telling you one more, here on freshwater fisheries. There's been very little attention to active fisheries catch reconstruction, for instance, in freshwater, and efforts to look at factors such as economics and social factors on these fisheries. The data that has been presented by the FAO contains three fundamental mysteries, which I'm going to start to address in this particular presentation. One is that the analyses that have been performed, and hopefully these slides, you can see my cursor here, because this is in black and white, this is by Bartley, but suggests that freshwater capture fisheries are growing very rapidly in Asian countries, even to the present day. This is a direct contrast with the situation in marine fisheries, and it doesn't make a great deal of sense because, of course, these highly populated areas are certainly subjected to overfishing and pollution, and it's just not clear how or why, and if it's even true, Asian countries, such as, you can see this figure here, and to some extent African countries, these are reported data, how this can be the case. And if it is the case, one has to worry about it, because it wouldn't seem to be sustainable at all. A second mystery is how culture fisheries, aquaculture can be increasing at the present rates that it is here, shown by this figure, and whether or not these data are bleeding over into capture fisheries through phenomena such as stocking and sharing of juvenile fishes. What is the relationship between capture and culture? And lastly, there are reports of significant underreporting in African fisheries in particular, underreporting of data to the FAO, as much as 50% or even greater perhaps. And this is a publication by Fouet and Chenard, and hopefully I'm saying correct, from Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So basically we've got a situation where the data that the UN is reporting, which is based on what they hear, doesn't really make a lot of sense, and one has to question it. So the goals of the present study were to see if we could use FishBase to correct freshwater finfish capture and culture data to the extent possible to make sure that those species are being correctly reported and categorized correctly, to see if we can then break it down, to see if these rates really are, the report rates to the FAO are increasing as they say they are, and if this is any relationship to socioeconomic tiers or sectors. In other words, are poorer countries or less well-developed countries reporting data in a different way than more well-developed countries? And might that be biasing the results? We also want to look at capture and cultured fisheries to see if they exhibit similar trends that might suggest direct relationship between the two. And we wanted to look whether there might be indications of reporting problems to the UN that might be influencing the relationships that we were describing. And lastly, we wanted to consider whether fisheries catch reconstruction might be used to actually correct some of these data to make them more accurate. So the methods, we downloaded, Dan Calamari's downloaded the inland fisheries and aquaculture data from the main FAO database between 1975 and 2015. We isolated the finfish data, categorized it as being exclusively freshwater species, brackish or diagenous. We were worried that maybe fish were being incorrectly classified, you see, or marine, looking for mistakes. This was done using FishBase. We then transferred cultured species that might be found in the capture data into the correct category. We didn't find very many, as it turned out. Checked identity and habitat. Some of the fisheries data by country and by year. Then we grouped them by what's known as the Human Development Index, HDI, which is a composite index of country GDP, gross domestic product, educational longevity, a sort of an indication of development. And we grouped them into top tier, well-developed countries, frankly, European countries, North America, second tier, which is basically China, and third tier, poorer countries, less well-developed, and plotted them. And I'll show you the results right now. So the first thing that popped out was that the increase in reported capture fisheries could be almost entirely attributed to data being reported by the poorly developed countries. That's what this orange line is here, going through 2015, which is showing still near linear increases year by year in reported capture fisheries, and now comprises something like 3/4 of the world's reported wild fish capture. Remarkable increases that just don't, hard to make sense of, actually, as I said before, and certainly very concerning if true. In contrast, equally, and I have some possible explanations, the reported capture rates of well-developed countries, frankly, such as France, Germany, United States, and Canada, have been dropping since the 1950s, in spite of the fact that we have some of the best managed, I mean, they're not perfect, best managed and highest quality freshwater ecosystems. Their catch rates have been dropping. And lastly, the medium level development, this is largely China. I'll break this down a little bit more. Their capture fisheries are pretty stable. Is that on average, only 26% of the fish being captured and reported to the UN are actually identified to a meaningful level, although there are a few exceptions. So we hardly have any idea of what's being caught. That's one of the punchlines by the world freshwater fisheries. I'm not going to talk very much about the aquaculture component, but I'll show you this one slide. But basically the trends are very different. World fish culture now, freshwater fish culture is almost 4 times that of capture, at least as reported. It's a different pattern with increasing in all 3 tiers, including the well-developed countries, which makes sense, and 90% of all the fish are being identified. And if you're interested, you can go to our paper and read more about it. But clearly, very different trend for capture and culture. I'm now going to very briefly then discuss the 3 main tier groups in a little more detail, and then wrap up with some conclusions. First, I will discuss the world's 50 of the world's least well-developed countries, which dominate world capture fisheries. Remarkably, 67% of all reported global freshwater fin fisheries in 2015 were attributed to this group of countries. The top 3 countries are Bangladesh, Myanmar, and India. Their captures have increased, sorry, typo there, almost 7-fold in the past 60 years, and are still remarkably increasing up to the present day without any clear explanation. And only 5% of the species they report to the UN are actually being identified, only 5%. One out of 20 fish that they catch, they're actually telling you what it is. And this means that, frankly, one of our objectives was to determine breakdown of fresh, brackish, and diagenous fishes, but and we show it in the paper, but honestly, I think you should question any of that because it's just 1 out of 20 fish being identified. Sorry, I skipped ahead. So, in conclusion, Bangladesh being the most major country in this particular species, the most commonly identified fish, but what that might mean when they're not identifying much of anything is highly questionable. Perhaps equally shocking to me anyway, is that the second tier, which comprises about a quarter of the world's fisheries in 2015, dominated almost entirely by China, also is reporting very few of the, identifying very few of the species that they're catching wild. And again, I wouldn't want to really draw any conclusions about which category, or whether they're freshwater, brackish, diagenous, or what species they are, although they do report that grass carp is the most commonly caught wild freshwater fish. Lastly, we better countries, and in terms of, again, I'm focusing now on wild-caught fishes. And Russia, actually, Russian Federation, which is the old USSR, pretty much dominates this category, and almost 50%. And it comprises, at the present time, only about 3% of the world's global fisheries, but they're identifying this group of countries, which of course includes France, they're identifying almost all the species, and it seemingly correctly, but the average catch rate is decreased about 40% in the past 60 years. And we provide details in the paper about different countries. Russia, again, dominating, and chum salmon being the most important species they report catching. Because they are identifying the majority of fishes, it's worth looking at a little bit at what these species might be and the trends, and that's the blue line right here. And when you look at exclusively stenohaline freshwater fishes, there's been some decline, and you might think this is probably real, with bream being the dominant species, Russian, caught primarily in Russia, I believe. And one point I guess I'll make right now is that very likely these data are based exclusively on commercial freshwater fisheries. At least this is my conjecture, which of course have been declining in the major well-developed countries, but they probably do not, in fact almost certainly do not reflect any effort in recreational fisheries. And I'm based in the central United States, where recreational fisheries dwarf any commercial fisheries, and huge numbers of fish are caught by recreational fisheries. So there's an issue with that. Brackish water fisheries do not seem to be particularly important. These are fish that live most of their lives in brackish water, not temporarily. And lastly, as you might expect, diagenous fishes, again, chum salmon, are the dominant group here, are rather reported as being rather important in freshwater capture fisheries by well-developed countries. So in conclusion, where are we? I would say the first point is that as a planet, we are presently managing global freshwater fisheries totally in the dark. We have no idea what we're catching. We have no idea what ages they are, what sizes they are. This may differ on a local basis, but it's certainly not being reported in the United Nations, and there's no global scheme. So issues of fisheries conservation at a global level are pretty much a moot point until this is solved. Secondarily, it appears that freshwater fisheries capture may well be increasing in poorly developed countries, although I certainly we can't refute that, but based on UN data, we see evidence for it. However, almost no species are identified. This is an extremely important issue because these countries depend on these less well-developed countries depend on these fish for food. And it would seem that this continued expansion just can't possibly be sustainable. And it's really something I hope that can be addressed at some point. In contrast, freshwater capture fisheries seem to be declining in well-developed countries, which did identify nearly all fish. However, it appears that they are not reporting recreational fisheries. So again, I would say we probably don't have a very good idea even here of what's going on. You can't tell from the United Nations databases where these fish are coming from, but anecdotal reports suggest that perhaps only Finland is actively reporting recreational capture fisheries. In any case, socioeconomic factors do appear to influence how fisheries are conducted and reported, because we could find distinct trends by tier. And many countries within a tier, such as third world countries, which contains Japan, Russia, Canada, for instance, France, come from very different areas of the world. So it's clear that socioeconomic factors, not just ecological ones, are probably important for freshwater fisheries, which makes sense. Lastly, it appears that, though this isn't a definitive study, that freshwater finfish culture is probably being properly reported. We couldn't find any indication of any errors there, and is growing as rapidly as it would appear. But it's not clear that it's having a dramatic effect on freshwater capture fisheries, i.e. they're not like catching a lot of larval fish in the wild and culturing them in ways that would impact freshwater fisheries in dramatic ways. In any case, the solution to this would seem to be a reanalysis of how data are being reported and what's known as fisheries catch reconstruction, to see if we can understand these fisheries better. Future direction then would include fisheries catch reconstruction using such things such as independent data reports, diet analyses, to see if we can actually assess what's being caught and used throughout the world in different socioeconomic and recreational fishing logs. Most of this data is already available because it would appear, it seems unlikely what being reported at the UN is correct, or at least complete, and then probably perform some kind of population modeling. So there's a lot of work out there that needs to be done in terms of fisheries conservation in the freshwater sector, which I would argue is a great deal of economic and ecological and societal importance. So thank you, and that's about all I have for today. And please feel free to contact me at my email address, or Dang, who's at the conference there, or find our paper online. If it's time, I would be happy to entertain any questions. Thank you.